extremely valuable to me, and I couldn't get them promoted in their own service because their services only rewarded what the service saw as core. You know, I had an Army major when I was at Centcom that single-handedly developed my entire strategy for the Central Asian states. He spoke the languages out there, he understood the culture, he was an artillery officer. He graduated college magna cum laude, finished #1 at Fort Sill, was a battery commander with outstanding fitness reports. When he made major, he went into the FAO program. And I put more medals on his chest and wrote him more glowing fitness reports. He failed the selection to lieutenant colonel. I had the same thing happen to an Air Force major that did the same thing. And there is the basis for some of the specifics. And I think things like the FAO program, an advisor cadre that we could put into place that all the services would contribute to, that would be valuable only if the services will support it and give a career path to those people, or else it's a dead end. You're going to compete against your counterparts that the services value in a way maybe more than say, combatant commanders or regional commanders do.
One of the issues is how many advisors do you need? If you have a situation like El Salvador, where we have a cap, there's not going to be any more than 55 advisors, then a specialized corps makes sense. If you're fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq simultaneously, and virtually the entire U.S. Army is mobilized to try to not only fight the wars, but provide advice and assistance, can we ever provide enough specialized individuals to cover all the bases that's needed? Historically, the Army has experimented with a variety of ideas and concepts along the idea of an advisory corps or something close to that. It never actually embraced the idea. One of the criticisms of the idea that's been given historically is that foreign officers want to hear advice from combat veterans. They don't want somebody who's just school trained. So unless the officer has an ability to serve in combat, as well as getting the specialized advisory experience, if they're just specialists in advice, they don't want to take those people seriously because they're not veterans of actual warfare. Probably the closest the Army came was an experiment in 1968 called the Military Assistance Officer Program, which was the idea to create a cadre of about 6,000 individuals who would be on staff billets just for these people, oriented mostly towards counterinsurgency, nation-building, third world type of service, advisory type of service. After several years of recruiting, rather than 6,000 people, they had 500. Nobody wanted to belong to this special group. The program eventually folded into the FAO program, which we still have today.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Major Jonathan Brown. I manage the Marine Corps FAO program. I'm happy to tell you that today Marine FAOs are getting promoted to Lieutenant Colonel at rates above the service average. And we just had 24.4% of our Marine FAOs and RAOs get selected for command. The Marine Corps has a dual-track program whereby Marines are allowed to go back to their primary MOS, go to combat in their primary MOS, and then during a B-billet time frame, go back and serve as advisors, foreign area officers, either on staffs or with security cooperation groups or as attachés, a variety of services like that. So we hope that we are taking the lessons that you are talking about and applying them today. And we're currently working on developing an enlisted version of our FAO program, foreign area staff NCOs, so that we can put this type of advice that you're talking about in the tactical level organizations like Marine Corps, Marine Expeditionary Units, the MUs, that are always on call, always over the horizon. So I just wanted to provide you some feedback from
I would add, what I think is critical, the services have, in the last couple of years, have taken a serious look at this, but what's critical is career paths, as you mentioned. And I think we ought to look at attaché, obviously duty on planning staffs at combatant commands, regional commands, where their expertise and their regional expertise comes into play. I think we need, and if we are going to create, say, an advisor cadre or an advisor instructional organization, it would be great to build the types of assignments that allow for development in there. I think the other point that you hit on, which is key, is if this is going to be additional or secondary, then they've got to be guaranteed credibility in their primary occupational specialty too. So it takes a lot of careful management that, I'm glad that,
Sir, it is
the services
a
are doing
full-time
that.
job, but it is well worth it. Thank you.
Afternoon, gentlemen. Your last two questions and last two responses provide a perfect segue for the next question. I think it should be pretty short, but Doctor, when you went up there, you were talking about the rewards for going into to becoming an advisor, selected duty assignment, consideration for your duties to be considered as command. In general, obviously, it worked out for you. You did pretty all right for yourself. But for the rest of those who went in as combat advisors, did the Army or the services honor their promise to treat that experience as something commensurate with appropriate command?
No.
Very hard to tell.
Okay, thank you.
But go ahead, Jim.
Yeah.
I can only give you my personal experience. I went over as an advisor because I said there were 4 infantry battalions left. Unless I wanted to be on one of the big fire bases or one of the big bases like Long Bend, then advisor was the only game in town. I was told to entice me to go that it will be command equivalent. I will jump forward to Fort Ord, where I was a company commander, and what I used to do, bring out the field files, the old brown files, which a few people in the room might remember, and they'd go through, somebody from here would go through, or the Hoffman building would go through your file and tell you how you were doing. And I said, well, how am I doing? And he said, well, you're doing okay, you're doing good. And he thumbs through my OERs, and I had 4 in Vietnam. He just thumbs over them. And I said, well, what about those? And he said, well, you're in Vietnam, but the war was kind of over, and you were an advisor, so it didn't really count. You had been better off if you had stayed and commanded a rifle company in Germany.
It's very hard to tell because what happens in officer evaluations and selection boards, you don't really know. Not publicized why you do or don't get promotion to a specific position, and there's really no statistics or data to show one way or the other. So what you have is a lot of anecdotal experiences like Jim's personal experience. There are other people I could cite who never had company command, who became general officers as a result, not as a result of being an advisor, but they were an advisor, they missed command, but they still got promoted, didn't stop them. Somewhere between 300 and 400 officers who served in Vietnam as advisors ultimately became generals in the U.S. Army. Considering the number of people who served in Vietnam, the advisory effort was quite tiny. That's a significant number of people, in my opinion, who became general officers. Now, that's just one statistic. Obviously, promotion is questioned, did you go from captain to major or whatever? But there certainly are documented instances of people getting below the zone promotions after they got out of being advisors, et cetera. Was that universal? How common was the experience? Very difficult to give any definitive thing. Most advisors felt that, like Jim, that the service of being advisor hurt their chances, although some statistics that have been shown show that to be actually not the case. So there certainly there was a widespread perception, a cultural understanding of the cultural institution of the Army, that the Army rewards command and not non-command assignments. And the Army tried very hard, as did the U.S. government, to persuade soldiers that was not the case. That public relations campaigns certainly failed. Nobody believed them. But whether it actually really did hurt people or help people is very difficult to say.
The Marine Advisory Unit, the advisors did very well. I mean, a number of general officers, certainly colonels and general officers that I'm sure at a much higher percentage, but it was a small organization, and so it's hard to draw conclusions from that. At the time, the tour of duty as an advisor held equivalent to, at least in the Marine Corps' eyes, held equivalent to a tour of duty in your occupational specialty, even in command. So the advisors that only had one tour in Vietnam, and that was it, that was respected as much as tours that were done with Marine units in the North. So there was no distinction made at the time, especially with the Marine Advisory Unit. The Marine Advisory Unit ended up being a very close-knit organization over its decade-plus time of existence. Matter of fact, we have a reunion every year with our Vietnamese counterparts. It made it out that suddenly, when Vietnam wanted to open up relations, many of them were released from the detention camps and have come over here.
It's kind of interesting, if I could add something here, that there's a parallel to today, and if there are folks in the room who have been advisors, they might bear me out or they might tell me I'm just full of it. But anecdotal evidence from where I work and watching classes come and go, that I won't go back how far because you would tell me, you could probably tell who I was talking about. A senior officer said, this is the only game in town. You know, essentially the same advisory speech. We have to work ourselves out of a job if this is going to work. And then some bright, enterprising young major stands up during the Q&A and says, well, okay, if we're advisors in the Army, we call that KD, Key and Developmental. You know, this is branch qualified is what we used to call it back in my day, so that you could get promoted to 05. And the answer was no. So I think at that particular point, it's changed now, but at that particular point, and this went on for several years, I think we're sending a mixed message out there if we're trying to convince people to be advisors. And I see more than a little of that evidence with people who cycle through Leavenworth, just talking to them about their experiences.
I think we have time for one more question.
My dad was an advisor there from 65 to 66 and 68 to 69. We've had a lot of discussions about his experience versus what I've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan. And one thing that we seem to be doing better now than we did then is the relationship between agencies out in the field. Anybody that's been to Iraq and Afghanistan can tell horror stories about, you know, the Department of State person or the USAID person or some other person. But in general, it seems to be institutionally a much better interaction than what he describes back then, especially between the conventional Army advisors and special forces that were working in the area, for which it seemed was generally a very negative and a very no interaction, if at all possible. And that is not, from what I've seen, the experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. And even the relationship between the USAID and the other folks in Iraq and Afghanistan, institutionally, there seem to be ways to get them to interact and work together. And his seemed to be strictly Army, and the other folks that were there was generally fairly contentious or negative or a result of personal relationships. And anybody's comments I'd appreciate.
Sure. Well, yeah, first of all, I would say I did an assessment in Iraq and Afghanistan for Centcom commanders. I would reinforce your point. Obviously, jointness is far better than it was in Vietnam. We didn't even know what it was then. You know, I mean, we basically deconflicted. We separated services by corps, and you know, there was no such thing. Joint operations were very difficult. The best I could say is they might have risen a little bit above deconfliction, not even into coordination or integration. And obviously today that's totally different. The other thing that impressed me in Afghanistan and Iraq was the integration of SOF and conventional forces. It's far better than it ever was. I would disagree with one thing. Interagency cooperation was much better in Vietnam than it is now. Only the Department of Defense is at war. When I did the assessment in Iraq, I sat every morning next to General Odierno at his morning briefing. I told him one day, if I closed my eyes, I would not know I was in a military operations center. Of course, he reeled back. I was afraid, since he's a big guy, he's liable to take it personally. And he said, what do you mean? I said, look at the things you're briefing. They were briefing how they were monitoring the date palm harvest and providing pesticides. They were briefing how they were running and controlling the museums, the zoos, and the recreational swimming pools. They were briefing what their mediation cells were doing in bringing the tribes and ethnic groups together to sort out their differences. They briefed the energy fusion cell, working on getting the electricity grid up. These are all uniformed military people. And I could go on and give you descriptions. And basically I said, where the hell's the Department of State, AID, Commerce? I saw the same thing in Afghanistan. The Government Corruption Task Force, headed by General McMaster's, and over 50% military. One guy from Justice Department. When I went out, and you guys know this better than I do, I went out to look at the provisional reconstruction teams, 80% military, not counting security. And, you know, I just, you know, at least I could say this in Vietnam, because I was in all 4 core areas. I bumped into those little suits and skirts running around doing unbelievable things. You know, some of them not well thought out, but I mean, there was a big presence out there in doing the things other than the military things. The military did not get stuck with the kinds of things they're being stuck with now. I think we actually have a worse situation in terms of interagency participation on the battlefield.
Did you want to comment on that, Jim?
No, I guess I didn't have the luxury of being around U.S. units because there weren't any. There were 2 battalions in Military Region 3. They were part of Task Force Gary Owen, and primarily they were securing Benoit Air Base, where all the helicopters flew out of. I did see what the general talks about with the interagency cooperation embodied in the CORDS program, and in Long Con Province, where Swan Lock, our division, was based at Swan Lock, there was a lot of good coordination between the province team from Long Con, which was across the street from the 18th ARVN Division headquarters, and the 18th ARVN Division. In that sense, I thought there was a pretty good cooperative effort there within the province. The fact that there are 40,000 less VC that died during the Tet Offensive certainly helped that situation, at least in Long Con Province and most of the others at that point.
I think it's hard to say. I don't know enough about Iraq and Afghanistan to make a direct comparison myself. As far as Vietnam goes, again, it could vary greatly over time, what level you're talking about. Certainly once CORDS was formed in 1967, for the remainder of the war, cooperation, collaboration, which was all under MACV, was a lot better than it had been prior to that, when there was a greater tendency of the agencies, both in Washington and Saigon, to protect their own turf. And that was difficult. In the field level, I think throughout the war, military and civilian advisors got along quite well, and there was quite a lot of mutual admiration between the 2 groups. But just as in present time, even in CORDS, the vast majority of the people in CORDS were military. They were not civilian. I think at the height, CORDS had about 1,000 civilian advisors and 6,000 military. So it was overwhelmingly a military effort doing all those civil type of things again.
With that, on behalf of Dr. Mahan, the Chief Historian of OSD and the heads of all the component history programs, I'd like to thank the 3 of you for a very excellent presentation today. We appreciate it, and I thank all of you for showing up. And just a very quick commercial, our next presentation comes up very quickly, a week from today at 11:30. We'll have Dr. Tom Clemens coming in, going back a little bit farther in history to talk about the Battle of Antietam in the Civil War. Thank you very much for being here today.
John, if you can get me to the river entrance, I would appreciate it.
I will do that, sir.